But I think some of you know me, but some of you don't. I'm Yael Aronoff. I'm the director of the Masrouri Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. This is one of my favorite events of the whole year, is the Student Undergraduate Research Conference, because we have about, I think, 750 students taking our 35 courses each year that cover Jewish studies, and right now about 47 minors. And so many of our students in minor classes do research projects, and so this is kind of a great way to showcase all the great research you've done, and extensive research, many of you, that also included field research and other things for some of you. So we're really proud of you, and it's a great way to kind of be able to, everyone see each other's research, because everybody's in different departments and colleges across campus to kind of come together and really hear each other, and also have sometimes your family and friends here to hear you. So before we get started, I just want to quickly say there's some flyers here. I'm always like the saleswoman, but just alerting you the events that are coming up. So Monday night we have a play discussion of the play Indecent that Professor Margot Bias is going to lead. And so there's a flyer for that. We have complimentary copies of the play in the Institute on the 7th floor of Wells. If you didn't already pick it up and you want to read the play, it's actually a short play. It's not heavy reading. It should be really interesting. And then I think it's on April 25th. It's on the flyer here, 22nd. The actors are going to, maybe you can say a little about it, because you're the one who organized it.
Yeah, so Peppermint Creek Theater is going to be putting on the play Indecent in June. It's a local theater company, but as part of Jewish Studies program, they're going to be doing a preview performance on campus on April 22nd in the Residential College of Arts and Humanities Theater, with a decent amount of the play plus music.
So you could actually just read the play, discuss it, and then see it kind of acted out, or many parts of it acted out. We also, on Thursday the 18th, have Doris Bergen speaking of sexual violence during the Holocaust. She is an amazing author from the University of Toronto, and I know that Deborah Margolis and Steve Weiland and Amy Simon all teach an honor seminar on using Holocaust testimonials, and they use her book in the class and think it's amazing and think it's fantastic. So
you know something about how the Holocaust? Read that book, and even the scholars will learn something new on every page. It's called War and Genocide: A Concise History of the Holocaust.
And there's a flyer here. It will be at 7 o'clock in the Kellogg Auditorium. So those are several things going on. I also know a week from today in the library, they're having a whole day, I think, forum on the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. So I know I teach that every year in my Madison 220 class, when I teach the 220 class, and Amy Simon is also going to be speaking there. So there's so much going on. And then there's also this Shostakovich Symphony the weekend of the 27th and 28th in the Wharton Center. I think students can go free. It's in commemoration of the Baba Yara massacres during the Holocaust. And again, Amy Simon, hi, Amy Simon and Matt Hawley from Jewish Studies are going to give the context for the symphony. So there's a lot going on. And also, some of you here are Jewish Studies minors or know what courses they, but those of you aren't, there's information here on courses like the 35 courses that are offered next year that count, checklists for minors, and you can always contact me if you have a question. Okay, let's get to the fun part. So we have 4 superb scholars here, so 3 of whom were in my senior seminar this fall under the lens of asymmetric conflict. And David Warshay will go first, but he's talking about the disputed outcome of Operation Protective Edge. That was the 2014 tragic war between Hamas and Israel. Thank God another war was averted, with tensions rising in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But the course really emphasized kind of the limited political and military long-term gains for these wars, and he'll be speaking on that. And Peji Masrouri wrote an excellent research paper looking at kind of the underground paramilitary Jewish organizations pre the establishment of the state and their kind of insurgency again, Britain as well, and looking at some of the dilemmas in a more historical context and a different context. And Kaila Waineo is talking about slavery in the front yard, how Israel successfully fought women's trafficking for prostitution. And she's been working on this honors thesis. David Warshay has also done an honors thesis on comparative genocide that he's going to present on the 25th, as is Kaila as well. And she's been working on this for about a year and a half, and it's based on a lot of interviews and field research in Israel from several different trips, and her internship with Aliza Levy, one of the Yesh Atid Knesset members who was active on this issue. Unfortunately, I heard that she's going to be out in this next government, but she was working hard on gender issues, and Kaila got very involved with that, so that should be extremely interesting. And then we have Ben Francis talking about minorities within the educational system of Israel, and he did this based on field research in Professor Kedem's class in the study abroad in Israel. So I know I've heard at least 3 of you before. I think you've done excellent research, but let's push them and challenge them and give them support, but also comments, because a couple of them are still continuing to write or continuing to edit for publication. So any comments and suggestions and constructive suggestions would be great. So David, you're going first? Okay.
So as Professor Aronoff had said, my research is about the Operation Protective Edge and kind of the disputed outcome with it. How both sides succeeded in the short term, both sides being Israel and Hamas, but both sides also failed in their long-term missions for the region. So first I'll go through the thesis and kind of explain the findings of the research and of the paper. So both sides completed their short-term goals during the conflict. Israel's short-term goal was to achieve a ceasefire and to kind of reestablish the deterrence factor with Hamas, while Hamas's short-term goal was to kind of show that they can still hurt Israel during the conflict. They were able to maintain rocket fire even during the ground incursion as well as the continuous airstrikes. And their other short-term goal was to kind of hurt Israel to the point where they were able to not force a ceasefire, but were able to bring them to the negotiating table. They did kill a number of civilians as well as soldiers and cause both economic and social damage to the country by shutting down, through multiple reasons, or multiple factors, but one of the major ones was they did shut down the airport for a short period of time. However, both sides did fail to achieve their long-term goals. Their long-term goals with Israel being continuous peace. That's kind of their goal since the founding of the nation, continuous peace and kind of peace in the region. They did fail at that as Hamas is still in power and still active in the region, while Hamas failed at their long-term goal, which was to really topple Israel and to establish their control over the entire area. They failed at that for various reasons as well that I will explore with this, or with the presentation. So first, I will go through a short summary of the conflict, and then I will dive into their short-term goals, their long-term goals, and why they both failed. So the conflict began July 8th with Israeli airstrikes, which were in response to rockets fired by Hamas. Over 30 tunnels were discovered leading from Hamas-controlled Gaza into southern Israel, and Israeli forces moved into the Strip in a sort of ground incursion. August 26th, the conflict concluded with a final ceasefire being signed. Then the total numbers were IDF struck 4,762 terrorist sites, and these sites have a broad definition from actual rocket launch sites to Hamas training grounds to kind of any sort of Hamas facility during the actual conflict. The IDF targeted 1,068 militants within the Strip of various affiliations. Those weren't just Hamas-affiliated terrorists, but they were also militants from other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad or some of the more extreme groups far further away from Hamas. And 225 Hamas rockets hit their marks within Israel with 2 civilian deaths. The vast majority of rockets fired by Hamas were either intercepted by the Iron Dome or simply failed to hit anything. A lot of the time they're not very sophisticated rockets, so they'll be shot off either through crude kind of launching techniques or just through shoulder-fired missiles. And they really just shoot them into the country and hope that it hits something. Most of the time it does just hit open fields. So now I will go into Hamas's short-term goals. Their short-term goals were to successfully repel the Israeli incursion from the Strip, as well as maintain their continuous kind of existence during the incursion. Their goal was also to to continue to fire the rockets during the invasion. They continued to fire them during both the airstrikes as well as the ground incursion. That was a major kind of success on their part, as they were able to kind of show not just their own constituents within Gaza, but also the larger Middle East and the larger world, that they were able to kind of overcome, or not exactly overcome, but to sustain the Israeli fire and the Israeli combat to the point where they were able to continue their operations even during the kind of conflict. They also killed a relatively large number of Israeli civilians and soldiers. They were able to kill a significant amount of the soldiers during the actual ground incursion. There have been reports through the IDF that during this ground incursion they were far more successful than during previous ones. That was due to an increase in training as well as an increase in tactics. A lot of the Israeli focus was on the tunnels, and oftentimes what would happen is the Hamas leadership knew that is where the Israelis were going, so they were able to kind of like rig the entrances or the exits of the tunnels with significant like explosives, as well as kind of like traps for the Israeli soldiers as they entered the tunnel. Then it was one of their other short-term goals was PR success, and that was the increase of BDS and just anti-Israel protests around the world. And those protests weren't just in the Middle East, which they had previously tended to be, like in major cities like Cairo or Riyadh, but they also extended to both European cities as well as international cities. There were protests in cities like London, Berlin, Paris, as well as international cities like Istanbul and as far away as Kashmir. So the Israeli short-term goals were to create peace in the south, or relative peace in the south for the time being, to destroy the tunnels, and to reestablish the deterrence. The deterrence was probably the most important thing, as they had to show Hamas that they can still hurt them and that there is a price to the continued rocket fire. While Hamas did achieve some of their short-term goals and in their minds did have relative success, they still were severely hurt, and a significant amount of their militants as well as their rocket fire and infrastructure was destroyed by the Israelis. So this was important for the Israeli leadership, as they were able to kind of show both their people as well as the people of Gaza that a conflict with them does hurt both sides, or does hurt Hamas as well as the civilians within Gaza, and as a way to kind of show that there are consequences for the continued rocket fire. Destroying the tunnels was also a major short-term goal, as that had kind of sparked the fear of many within the Israeli public, as there were kind of nightmare scenarios where on a holiday or something the ground would open up in a communal dining room or even a personal dining room, and then all of a sudden Hamas militants would jump out and kill everyone. So that was a very prevalent thought within the minds of the Israeli civilians. So successfully destroying the tunnels and kind of telling the populace that the tunnels are destroyed was a very important goal. So next, the long-term goals, and this is really where both sides did fail in the conflict and did not succeed in their overarching geopolitical goals. So Hamas's long-term goal has always been to destroy Israel and to establish a Palestinian Islamic government over the land that goes from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And they obviously failed at this goal. Even though they were able to maintain a rocket fire, they obviously cannot destroy the Israeli military. However, this long-term goal was a bit changed actually recently, as there was changing to the Hamas charter, but many within both the Middle East as well as the global community do not actually believe that the change was they believe that the change was superficial and didn't actually go skin deep. They think that it was purely for kind of PR tactics and not really a change in strategy or long-term goals. The Israeli long-term goals were to create a lasting peace within southern Israel. And this is essentially the goal of the country since its founding. Creating the lasting peace and allowing their people to live and prosper within their country has kind of been their goal since 1948. And they did fail in this goal, as Hamas still exists and still does pose a threat, while it is a diminished threat. But as the past weeks and kind of past months have shown it is still a threat and that is continuous. So now why the goals failed, and this is kind of the answer to the research question, why they failed. So for Hamas, they failed because they simply lack the capabilities to take on the Israeli Defense Forces and to take on Israel as a whole. They are really incapable of overpowering the IDF and destroying it and establishing their own rule. If they did have the capabilities and if they did have the manpower, the weapons, the air support, everything like that, I have no doubt that they would do it and actually succeed in that, but they simply don't have the ability to do that. And on the Israeli side, the reason that they failed in their long-term goals is that they lack the will to actually go about and to destroy Hamas. In order to do that, it would require a massive incursion into Gaza and most likely a long-term continuous presence in the Strip, which, as Lebanon and sort of Gaza has already shown, that is not sustainable within Israel, either through the military or through the public, neither of which support long-term continuous presence within a hostile population, as the two previous conflicts have shown. The Israeli government also lacks kind of the domestic ability to send and to maintain the presence, as it would cost soldiers their lives, and eventually the Israeli public would kind of get fed up with the continuous soldier deaths, because in the country, every soldier is kind of viewed as kind of the nation's children due to the mandatory draft. Another factor, though, or another reason why the Israeli goal failed is that there's simply no alternative to Hamas at the moment. The Palestinian Authority does not have the capabilities to kind of maintain control over Gaza, and one of the fears within the Israeli military establishment is that if they do successfully go in there and take out Hamas, then something worse will rise up, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad or one of the other more extreme terrorist organizations. That lack of an alternative is kind of one of the main reasons that the military establishment is unwilling to commit the soldiers and the necessary resources to successfully take out Hamas. There's simply no kind of plan B, because, as I said, a continued military presence is simply not sustainable. So, the conclusion. The cycle, or the inability to complete their goals, due to the inability to complete their goals, this cycle will continue. And by that, I mean both sides will continuously come into conflict, as this past kind of months and weeks have shown. Hamas will, due to internal and as well as external pressure from various Arab governments that supply them with money, as well as internal pressure from the Palestinians that live within Gaza, will continue to kind of attack Israel, as they blame Israel for all of the, either rightly or wrongly, they blame Israel for all of the economic and social issues within Gaza. So in order to kind of tamper the anger of the Palestinian population, they will continue to attack Israel and to blame Israel. And because of that, there will be continuous kind of conflict there. And that is why maintaining these ceasefires is one of the only things that kind of the world community can do to stop this, as the world community is kind of unwilling to either accept a Hamas-dominated area or to accept the Israeli incursion and then continuous presence. So the ceasefires are one of the only ways that they can kind of maintain the peace in the region. And one of the most important things to the ceasefires is the economic aid, which unfortunately currently is kind of being cut off by various factors, external as well as internal within kind of the Palestinian Authority. I believe the PA has stopped giving money to Gaza, or to Hamas, to kind of pay the civil servants there, which does kind of deteriorate the entire situation within the Strip, and that does lead to economic issues, and economic issues lead to Palestinian protests, which we have seen over the past few months, and those protests do lead Hamas to kind of take action, and that action does eventually, well, not now, but in theory, it does eventually lead to another conflict. And that is why economic aid is one of the only tools that the world has to keeping the peace within the region.
So we'll, I think, just do all four of you before we get into questions and discussion. So, right, then,
Do you need the computer?
Yes.
I don't know if we should keep it short.
You want to
Because
object?
on one hand, we want to welcome people, on the other hand, I don't know if it gets noisy.
Completely up to you. Only good. I can always talk loud.
Compromise.
Other way.
All right. So, hello everyone. I am Pejman Masrouri. As Professor Enoch said, I was a student in our senior seminar last semester, which was on the dilemmas of asymmetric wars. So I chose for case study of asymmetric war a historical example being the pre-State of Israel Jewish paramilitary and insurgent groups which waged a several year-long campaign against the British Mandate authorities in the Mandate of Palestine at the time. It primarily constitutes three main insurgent groups. You have the Haganah, which was the largest one, Jewish self-defense militias, which is the middle sort of emblem there. You have the Irgun, which was a breakaway from the Haganah, formed later on by more kind of hardline factions, which Menachem Begin would make famous later on, which is on the right. And then, of course, there's a breakaway from the breakaway called Lehi, which is on the left, who broke away from the Irgun when they thought the Irgun was getting too soft. So it was rather interesting because we like to think of a lot of asymmetric struggles as a fairly recent phenomenon. We like to think of terrorism as very kind of recent. You know, they didn't have to deal with that back in the day. That's very incorrect. And this kind of example serves as one of the first examples in the modern era of not only asymmetric conflict, but what I discovered, a successful one. So despite, we often like to think that using terrorism and other sort of asymmetric tactics that's not a success. You know, terrorists don't win. But in this doing the research into this, ultimately they found out that it really did work for them. They were successful. They accomplished a lot of their objectives, and terrorism was just one of the many sort of tactics that they were using, tactics and strategies. But ultimately they were able to accomplish their objectives, not only due to their own skill, but also due to them being able to utilize a lot of the sort of situational conditions they were presented. So it wasn't necessarily just entirely due to them, but also the situation at the time. But let me get into the origins of it first, which is very important to understand before we get into the groups itself. So, origins of conflict. A lot of you probably know a little bit of the history already. But as a lot of you know, territory of Palestine was, for a very, very long time, centuries, part of the Ottoman Empire, fairly neglected part of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't do too much, didn't have a huge population, but it was growing in the later years. And then during World War I, it was taken from the Ottoman Empire by the British Empire. General Allenby led a campaign, kicked the Ottomans and their German leaders out, and from that moment on, Britain took control of it, officially became a League of Nations mandate in the aftermath of World War I, but in de facto, in reality, it was British-controlled territory, practically a British colony. And most famously, in 1917, Britain issues the Balfour Declaration in 1917, officially supporting the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The term is important. Doesn't mean an independent Jewish state. At the same time, part of the reason for this, Britain wanted to get support from a lot of the kind of global Jewish community. There was already some support there. Their existing Chaim Weizmann. Also, forgive me, I've never taken any Hebrew, so my Hebrew pronunciations will be atrocious. So Chaim Weizmann and Zev Jabotinsky and others kind of like them had already sort of proposed to the British to support them in various ways, primarily by creating like their own sort of Jewish, a Jewish legion, so to speak, Jewish military groups that would fight for the British Empire and the Allied side. A lot of the Zionists hoped that by serving the Allied powers that they would be rewarded later on, and they were correct in this instance. And the British issued the Balfour Declaration and got a huge amount of support from the Jews. And that sort of took upon the Jews themselves, and that sort of took it upon the British themselves to create the necessary conditions to allow this Jewish national home to exist, which included allowing Jewish immigration, increased Jewish immigration to the territory of Palestine. There were already a small Jewish community there, but it would increase soon. So, wide-scale Jewish immigration to Palestine. Unsurprisingly, this caused a backlash over the native inhabitants, the Palestinians at this time, or at this time the Arabs. British failed to defend the Jewish community in Palestine. Very quickly after, in 1921, there already started to be anti-Jewish riots, which sparked for a variety of reasons. Jews were targeted and killed in large numbers. Britain, unfortunately, proved very ineffective to defend them at this point. They relied a lot on local Arab policemen who weren't too eager to police their own ethnic brethren, and also themselves had some prejudices against the Jewish inhabitants. So a lot of Jews were killed. So that sparked the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv. So that sparked the Yishuv and other Jewish leaders, including Zev Jabotinsky, to create Jewish self-defense militias. So they formed these to defend themselves from Arab attacks, solely defensive, no offensive operations whatsoever. They essentially guarded, patrolled, escorted, and defended the existing sort of Jewish communities there. Later on, they would all merge together to form the Haganah, the United Self-Defense Forces. So this is where the Irgun happened. So the tension increases throughout the years of the Mandate. So in 1929, an even worse Arab riot broke out. More than 100 Jews are killed. A lot of this was sort of a breaking point within the Haganah itself. There was a lot of people who were extremely angry at the static and defensive policies of the Haganah. So particularly, there were more hardline members of this organization who desired to go on to have more aggressive operations, to go on the offensive. They didn't want to merely sit on the defensive while they were being attacked by Arab groups, by Arab communities. They thought the best option, by going on the offensive, by carrying out reprisal attacks, that they could better defend the Jewish community and sort of put the Arabs on guards and let them know that there's a price for what they're doing. They thought that was the way to stop the attacks. So they posed the restraint. This led to a secession crisis right in 1929, where the more aggressive and typically right-wing members of the Haganah left the organization, split off, and formed a new organization called the Haganah Bet, B, which later on would merge with some other revisionist Zionist groups to form the Irgun. So, the Irgun, I mentioned revisionist Zionism. It was essentially the militant arm of revisionist Zionism, which is a more right-wing alternative to the dominant labor Zionism that was mostly dominant throughout the Jewish community. It was essentially the ideological brainchild of Zev Jabotinsky, who we mentioned before. So this organization primarily was created to retaliate against Arab provocation. They wanted to go on the offensive, which the Haganah was not allowing. So they immediately started carrying out reprisal operations against the Arabs. For instance, if Arabs would come in and kill a Jewish woman on the streets, they would go into an Arab town and kill an Arab woman on the streets. That was the kind of operations that they designed it for. They wanted to sort of, equal the playing field, so to speak. Sorry, my PowerPoint messed up a little bit there. But they didn't have a lot of support from the Jewish community. They thought that they were breakaway extremists. Again, they did not have a lot of support from the broader Yishuv as a whole. They thought that they were too militarized, they were too aggressive, they were making the situation worse. They compared them to the Italian black shirts and the German brown shirts. That's kind of what they used to kind of insult them. They're like, you're overly militarizing yourself in this paramilitary. You're looking like the fascists, etc. It's very important to note they were not anti-British at all at this point. They were strictly speaking anti-Arab. In fact, they were kind of pro-British. Zev Jabotinsky was very much an Anglophile. They saw that they very much saw Britain as capable of fulfilling their aspirations of having a Jewish national home. They kind of wanted to present themselves as a worthy partner, so to speak. But that their hopes for the British would be dashed fairly soon. So, Britain itself began to shift policy at this point. They very much underestimated the Arab backlash to their support of Zionism and increased Jewish immigration. So they kind of began to recalculate their policy here. So they started to flip-flop. So they decided that it might not be in their best interest to just all-out support Zionism. And they thought that there could be more benefit to even supporting or appeasing the Arab side of the conflict, especially because the Arabs were the ones primarily instigating the instability, and they wanted to calm down the situation in the Mandate. So ceased to further support of Zionism, gave Arabs increased concessions, such as reducing the amount of land being sold to the Jews, giving the Arabs a greater degree of self-governance. They giving more power to the Arab High Committee, a little bit more autonomy for them, and just being less openly supportive of the Jews was the primary thing. And yeah, it's important to note that their foreign policy was very much, Palestine was a part of a larger foreign policy. They thought one of the reasons why it was important to keep the Arabs content was because there's not only a lot more of them, but there's an entire region of Arab countries that they did not want to anger. They thought that it was more, regardless of the Jews or even Palestine, it was more important for them strategically to ensure the goodwill of Arab countries. So most important for them was ensuring the safety of the Suez, ensuring that they had oil from various Arab states, and that they were pretty content. And all of them, of course, all of the Arab states opposed Zionism. So this leads to the most violent Arab revolt of 1936-1939. So this was an Arab revolt directed against the British colonial authorities. So the Arab High Committee, which was the nominal Arab government of Palestine, together with other Arab groups, were extremely unhappy with how the British were handling the Mandate. They, thought they were illegitimate colonial authorities. There was an increase in Arab nationalism generally. They wanted an independent state, a state with where their sovereignty would be recognized more, and they were in particular angered by Britain's support for the Jews and the Jewish communities. This revolt targeted the British and the Jewish community as a whole. Again, hundreds of Jews were killed during this. Irgun expanded, intensified operations, and together the Irgun and the Haganah worked together with the British authorities, including the British military, to put down this revolt, and they were a critical part of that. Primarily, especially because they were on the ground and Britain lacked the intelligence and a lot of the kind of tactical sort of operational capabilities to deal with a lot of the Arab attacks, despite their military presence. So the broader Jewish community was extremely helpful in helping Britain coordinate their actions. So together with Britain's military efforts to cease the revolt, in addition to the Haganah's assistance and also continued sort of self-defense of their own communities, the Irgun, meanwhile, is of course carrying out offensive reprisal operations with Britain's consent. Now, despite all of this, despite how much the British worked with the Jews, this revolt convinced Britain actually to appease the Arabs even further. At this point, it's 1939, very close to the outbreak of war in Europe. Britain just really wants to pacify the whole situation. They thought they just wanted calm, especially if war was brewing in Europe, which was their primary concern. So they thought that if they were to just appease the Arabs, give them what they want, end the revolt, and end any chance for them to continually destabilize the situation, that would be best in British policy. So that's exactly what they did. This man on the right is Haj Amin al-Husseini, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He led the revolt. He became famous later on for collaborating with Hitler. So this was another kind of massive shift. They had already been kind of moving towards being more balanced, working with the Arabs a little more. Now they are decidedly pro-Arab and anti-Zionist in policy. So 1938, first Jew in Palestine is executed. This enraged the Jewish community. He was executed for he carried out an attack on Arab civilians. I believe it was a bus full of Arabs. It was a failed attack. He didn't actually manage to kill or really injure anyone, but since he had the intent, Britain arrested him and had him executed despite pleas for clemency in that regard. Britain wanted to do this to show that they were more even-handed. Britain had killed a lot of Arabs over the years, putting down the revolts. So they wanted to show that they were even-handed, that they are not going to just blindly support the Jews in these situations. So Britain didn't take any serious action to punish the Arabs who were involved in the revolt. Again, Haj Amin al-Husseini from the last page didn't get any punishment. The rest of his high committee didn't. They were instead kind of accommodated. Not a lot of action were taken against them. And then infamously, the White Paper of 1939 was issued. Completely contradicted the Balfour Declaration. And in particular, it advocated it stated that in time, an independent Palestinian state would be established, and in particular, restricted Jewish immigration and land purchases. This was kind of the breaking point for a lot of the Zionist community. This completely contradicted their previous claims. So again, Britain's priorities were Europe, not Palestine. So, response to Jewish community. This is kind of when the insurgency itself starts. They were outraged, like I said before. This kind of relationship would never recover. And if you combine the British White Paper with a lot of countries around the world, including the United States, not accepting refugees at this time, this Lehi and Irgun come together, form this joint organization to coordinate the insurgency campaign. And they coordinate against the British. All of them had sort of ambitions and interest in this. It benefited all three. This is where the insurgency was at its peak. Intensification, a lot of attacks were carried out. Most notably were the 1946 Night of Bridges, and then later the King David Hotel bombings, which the King David Hotel bombing in particular is extremely famous. Both of these devastated the British. Night of Bridges destroyed a lot of the British railroads that caused an immeasurable amount of damage to them. King David Hotel bombing, the King David Hotel was the headquarters of the British colonial administration. It was an attack carried out by the Irgun, but the Haganah actually requested, or at least sanctioned, some form of attack on it because they possessed incriminating evidence against the Jewish agency and Jewish community, showing that they were supporting the insurgency. The British, surprisingly, basically were mostly targeting the Haganah and Jewish community at this point. They arrested a lot of the Jewish agency leaders because they didn't have a lot of intelligence on the insurgents like the Lehi and Irgun. The only people they could find were the civilian leaders. Sorry.
I know you're
I'll
creating a
skip it.
40-minute presentation in the seminar to.
I'll skip ahead a little bit. So British public opinion was very negative towards everything that was happening. A lot of people wanted them to pull out, including the politicians. They were unable to crush the insurgents militarily, despite their possible ability to do so. They just didn't have the political will to do it. So the insurgents ultimately were victorious. Britain eventually yielded to all the pressure and decided that they couldn't maintain their control at the point, and they just decided we're just going to completely leave the mandate, give it to the UN to decide, and they were basically out. They had encountered far more resistance than they had anticipated. It was extremely unpopular. They couldn't hold it. Their whole empire was in shambles, and yeah, so that was kind of my presentation.
So we're shifting gears here from asymmetric wars which Kaila also did, but on the War in Afghanistan Center, to the thesis project that you were working on.
So hi everyone. My name is Kaila, and today I'm going to be presenting my senior honors thesis to you, and my thesis is on Israel's impressive transformation in regards to combating sex trafficking. Not many people know this, but Israel had a huge problem with sex trafficking like before the year 2000, and now it rarely has any instances of sex trafficking. So I was inspired to write this paper for my experiences interning in the Knesset in the summer of 2017, where I interned for a member of Knesset, Elisa Levy, who was the chair of the Committee on Women's Trafficking and Prostitution. And so I was able to learn a lot from her and all the people working with the committee. So yeah, a lot of my sources just come from interviewing the people that I was working with. And so first I'm going to give you an introduction on sex trafficking. What is it? What countries struggle with it? How is the international community dealing with it? And then I'll give you an introduction on prostitution in relation to sexual trafficking, as Israel's tackling both of these issues as one. And the main issue in my research that I'm looking at is I'm trying to answer, how is Israel so successful in fighting women's trafficking and prostitution? Going from like having such a horrific issue to now having like very limited instances, and they're caught right away of any type of sex trafficking. Like, what makes them so successful? So many countries are struggling with it. The US is struggling with it. In East Lansing, just weeks ago, we get reports of like sex traffickers trying to abduct people on this campus. Like, and I think last year 23 children were freed in downtown Lansing from sex trafficking. So it's like really real, and it's like right here. So, you know, what can we learn from Israel's case? And like, what really determines a country's success in fighting it? Like, what pushes them to take action? So yeah, kind of depressing, but it's about success. So like, what is sex trafficking? Like, first of all, it's really a global business. It's $58 billion per year, which is like larger than the GDP of like many Latin American countries. It's the second biggest like kind of black market type thing, second to drugs. And at this moment, like right now, there are 2.5 million people around the world being trafficked. It exists in every country, and it's demand driven. It relies always on vulnerable people. I mean, anyone can be a victim, but it's really a lot of vulnerable people, like refugees. It's defined as like forcing someone to participate in like commercial sex acts, like and like I said, people are abducted or deceived into it, and it's really fueled by like conflict and corruption, because traffickers can really take advantage of a situation where there are no police. And despite the overwhelming nature of it, like government policy plays a huge role in fighting it, and smart anti-trafficking policies can help victims escape from their pimps, decrease the number of women and girls smuggled across the border, and foster more successful rehabilitation and reintegration. So what is the international community doing to stop this? So recognizing like the pervasiveness, severity, and repulsiveness of sex trafficking, the United States and the United Nations have tried to do a lot, and that really started in 2000 with the passing of the Palermo Protocol and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And yeah, the main player really has been the United States. They have extensive programs in fighting trafficking, and what they do every year is they release the Trafficking in Persons Report. So the Trafficking in Persons Report, what it does is it ranks countries on tiers, and I'm going to mention this a lot, so I'm having this outline on what the tier statuses are. So the first one is tier 1, and that means that the country is compliant with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Palermo Protocol. And really what that is a minimum standard of actually fighting trafficking. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It means that they're taking concrete steps to be compliant. So like the US is compliant, but we still have problems here. Tier 2 is they're not compliant, but they've started making some significant efforts. So tier 2 watch list is kind of like countries that were tier 2, but then they stopped making those efforts. It's kind of like a warning. And then tier 3 is the country's not compliant and they're not making any efforts to do anything about it. And so they're also under the threat of sanctions from the United States. And that's where Israel was in 2001. So not only was Israel having like a large amount of trafficking, but the US even recognized that they hadn't done anything. And in the report, they were even saying that the government had actually helped traffickers. So it's really bad to be in tier 3. So yeah, the United States says that countries can improve their tier standing by implementing strong and comprehensive anti-trafficking laws, which are signaling their commitment to fight it and allow police officers to secure convictions. Because like a really huge problem is that, you know, you might convict someone, but the laws aren't in place to, you know, say, you know, to protect the victims. Like, for example, within the United States before the 2001 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, victims of trafficking were not protected under the anti-slavery statutes, despite it being essentially the same thing, because they weren't recognizing psychological coercion, taking of passports and things like that, which most victims go through. They also need to, according to the United States, really deter traffickers by setting long prison sentences. Sometimes traffickers are given community service around the world. Like, that can't be the response. It has to be long jail sentences to prove that, you know, this is a severe thing. And also, a lot of the time, the judges are not experienced in trafficking cases. There are always issues with understanding the victim, understanding what is the situation that they were in. So a lot of the times training needs to happen, and the US trains thousands of its government employees. All of the employees in the Department of Transportation, for example, are taught to look at what are the signs of trafficking. So looking at all these things, you would suspect that democracies would really be the best in fighting trafficking, because we have 3 branches of government. We have low levels of corruption. You know, we are saying that freedom is really important. But while democracies are better than non-democracies at fighting trafficking, less than half of them are compliant with the Palermo Protocol and the U.S. Victims Protection Act. And that's just interesting to me. I was like, well, if it isn't, you know, the democratic institutions that are really driving countries to fight trafficking, you know, I don't expect, like, war-torn countries or developing countries to be able to fight trafficking as well as democracies. You know, what is the other factor that's going on? And it turns out that the number of tier 1 countries has only increased by 7% in the last 17 years. So the United States response, the pressure, is not exactly working. And in trying to understand this, the ambassador at large from the U.S. Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking and Prostitution, Luis de Baca, he says that the real problem can come from a culture surrounding this issue. He says criminal sentences, if obtained at all, seem to reflect an assumption that of a victimless crime involving unsavory women, or a conception that illegal migrants or marginalized ethnic groups deserve their situation and were lucky to even have work, even if it was enforced through the unholy trinity of debt, threat, and violence. And if you look in the Trafficking in Persons report and look at the countries that are democratic and that have stayed on tier 2 or tier 2 watch list or tier 3 for a while, it kind of does reflect this, because the reason why they remain in these categories is because they're not cracking down on, say, police collusion, or they're still setting short sentences for traffickers. And in some cases, like in Japan, they were ignoring victims or blaming them for crimes that they committed as a result of being trafficked, or seeing them as delinquents. So, and there's also this component that in order to stop trafficking, you do need to address demand, because in countries like, say, the United States or Europe, and very wealthy countries, they're destination countries for traffickers. So if there's prostitution there, the traffickers will bring their victims there. So you also have to address demand in order to limit the amount of trafficking in your country. And that does involve changing the culture. So I just talked kind of about that, the relation between sex trafficking and prostitution. And when they were formulating the Palermo Protocol and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, it was touched on, this issue was touched, they discussed this then as well. They debated whether prostitution itself should be within the definition of trafficking. They argued that it is a process, including the recruitment and transport of victims through force, coercion, fraud, for an exploitative end purposes. They argued that prostitution is inherently exploitative and degrading to women. And proponents say that there's really no difference between forced and voluntary prostitution and believe that states ought to prohibit it. It's a dangerous job psychologically and physically to have. Polling people involved in prostitution, looking at the type of violence that they face, it's almost always at some point. So it's not really a safe working condition. So now to the question that I was asking, what explains Israel's move from Tier 3 to Tier 1 and decision to incriminate the clients of prostitution? And spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you my thesis, what I found before I explain. So my argument, I argue that while Israel's ability to maintain close cooperation between its legislature, police, and government ministries, lasting under the leadership of several different governments, did aid in its success fighting sex trafficking. Its democratic institutions did aid in its success, of course. It was really the persistent activism on part of member of Knesset Zava Galon that pushed Israel from Tier 3 to Tier 1. Through repeatedly reaching out to the news media and establishing a subcommittee and task force on combating sex trafficking, member of Knesset Galon was able to create that change in national consciousness, which ensured the legislature, police, and government ministries' continual involvement in fighting trafficking. And while the publication of the Trafficking in Persons report by the United States did alert Israelis of their country's problem, Galon's efforts really brought women's trafficking and prostitution to the forefront of policy discussions and influenced Israelis to treat these problems as serious and urgent public concerns. And what I will talk about later is that, the thing before about what Luis Sebaca was saying, that sometimes, these people are immigrants or they're marginalized groups, and so they're lucky to even deserve work. Something that Zava Galon did was, she knew that saying Netanyahu was not that nice on migrant laborers. She framed it as a women's issue rather than an immigration issue, which got basically everyone in the Knesset on board with her. So just outlining the really grave situation before 2000. Thousands of women each year were smuggled across the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula into Israel, where they were actually sold in auctions to pimps. And the majority of these women were around 20 years old and born in the former Soviet Union. And there's not really accurate statistics, but we know that in 2003, over 3,000 women were taken across the border to serve in one of Israel's 400 brothels. And some of the women did know that they were coming to work in prostitution. Some of them didn't. Some of them thought they were going to be maids or cleaning women. But regardless, they didn't know that they would be abused, unpaid, and unable to leave. A lot of the time, they will confiscate their documents, their passports, all of the papers that will allow them to leave the country. And then in that situation, they're afraid to go to the police because they have no documents. So, yeah, that placed Israel on Tier 3 in the first Trafficking in Persons report. So at that time, the State Department claimed that the Israeli authorities were dedicating little resources to combating trafficking. They had no efforts to cooperate with other governments like the Soviet Union they detained victims and deported them, probably seeing it as more of an illegal immigration issue, and they didn't encourage the women to raise charges against their traffickers. But now, the good thing is that Israel has had Tier 1 status for not the past 5 years, the past 6 years, now it's 2019. And in 2010, there was not a single instance of trafficking for prostitution at all. And since 2001, there have been very limited instances of women being taken across the border to engage prostitution. The majority of the time, they come by planes, and before they enter Israel, they're asked many questions. And it's, because say the Soviet Union, there's you have a 90-day tourist visa, so some women are being told to come here, work for 90 days, and then leave, but the airport has done a good job at screening people who come in to make sure that this isn't happening. So Israel's response was really Zava Galon. She established this committee that worked really hard and also worked with the State Department to decrease trafficking in Israel. And what it did is that it was very interactive. Like, they brought everyone. Like, they brought all the Knesset members to brothels to talk with victims. They were working with the police. They were coordinating everything. They created new offices to specifically deal with this issue. And that really just engaged all of the policymakers to get involved. And it ensured that they were involved because they were following up every week. And the State Department was following up like at least a monthly basis. And so the committee accomplished a lot. It provided recommendations for each governmental ministry and implemented laws enforcing its recommendations. So if they brought you to the committee and you hadn't done what you were supposed to do last week, they could actually enforce you to do it. The Ministry of Justice was instructed to better defend the rights of the women and men that were victims of trafficking by not mentioning their names in indictments, writing stricter instructions regarding the cases in which the brothels may be closed. They got Russian-speaking police units to deal with the women that were being trafficked. They formulated a witness protection program, and they held special training sessions for all the policemen in Israel. And the committee recommended that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs establish contacts with other consulates so that they could get the victims their passports and documents back. And so, according to Sigalit Ezri, the former director of this committee, she said that these trips and these meetings were really influential in motivating the Knesset members in making change, and that this is what really got legislators involved. And she also said that it was Zava Galon that actually was able to change the attitudes of the government officials and the public, and to see the trafficked women as victims rather than illegal immigrants. And she consistently pushed the news outlets to report on trafficking, which made Israelis horrified of the issue. And her ambition really drove the committee to serve as a watchdog over these authorities. If anyone was making sure that the committee was really doing its job, it was her. And she described the situation in the late 1990s as one of the most serious and despicable developments since the founding of the State of Israel. She said, I believe that the State of Israel cannot view itself as a well-ordered and democratic state unless it upholds the principle of human dignity and freedom and recognizes that the trafficking in women is a difficult and serious social problem that must be eradicated at all costs. She also said she wanted the Knesset members to understand that in the front yard of Israeli society, there was sexual slavery, which must be eradicated. So in that way, she's framing the issue as more of a women's issue than one pertaining to illegal immigrants. Of course, we should be protecting immigrants, but that doesn't always work politically. But she was able to get more people involved by seeing it as a broader issue connected to women's status in Israel and around the world. She said that, in prostitution, it's saying that there's a trade in women as goods for sexual consumption, that women can be purchased. And Netanyahu gave her the Israeli President's Medal in 2009 for her efforts to combat women's trafficking. So since 2001, Israel has kept Tier 1 status, and now they are working to incriminate the clients of prostitution. Zava Galon brought this up in 2007, and little by little, this has come to the forefront of policy discussions as well. And they're trying to change the public consciousness using that same line of thought that women cannot be bought as goods for sexual consumption, and that's not something that Israel wants to send a message to the world as something that they're okay doing. And so they're also arguing that the situation now, even though 90% are Israeli citizens, it's not entirely unlike the situation of women that were being trafficked in the early 2000s. So they're saying that women are not given a real choice to enter the industry, and the statistics are really alarming. Like 11% are minors. The majority are the majority are mothers with children under the age of 18, where their children are subject to
university degrees for first generation Ashkenazis already, far surpassed the 28.8% of second generation Mizrahis getting a university education, there's still a massive increase between the 11% in the first generation to the second generation being almost 30%. So I found that very interesting. And then the next group that I will be examining will be Ethiopian Jews, and I compared them to the rest of the Israeli population because I couldn't really find statistics that showed just Ashkenazi Jews versus Ethiopian Jews education. And to discuss Ethiopian Jews, however, there's a need to also discuss the context and their place in Israeli society. So since the creation of the State of Israel, Israel has encouraged the movement of Jews to move back to Israel, which was solidified in 1950 with the passing of the Law of Return, which allowed for every Jew the right to migrate back to Israel, instilling the continuous revival of the Jewish people in their own homeland, and also as an insurance policy for a safe haven in Israel if there is a need based on anti-Semitism growing in the world or anything of that sort. And in 1991, the second largest wave of Jews from Ethiopia migrated to Israel, which was called Operation Solomon. But a big issue was they were unable to really integrate into the society, despite also during this time, around a big fluctuation of Russian refugees came into Israel based on the collapse of the Soviet Union, wanting to find somewhere else to live. But many of these Russians actually were less Jewish than what the Ethiopians would consider themselves, but because they did have a lineage of being Jewish, they were accepted into the Law of Return. So there's different factors with why Russians integrated a lot better into society compared to Ethiopians. One being some Russians came in already educated, going to university, going to high school, and having proper European education. Well, most Ethiopians lacked education and a knowledge of Ethiopian culture. European culture. And a big issue was a lot of Israeli society questioned the legitimacy of Ethiopians being Jewish, even though, which I already stated, was most Russian immigrants were less observant than these Ethiopian Jews coming to Israel. And because of this, most Ethiopian Jews were left in the periphery of society without the ability for upwards mobility and movement of social classes in the future. And for these reasons, they suffered neglect, unemployment, poverty, and had to face crime and alienation based on subhuman statuses. And for these reasons, Ethiopians' place in society can be shown in household expenditures in the Ethiopian household. So I show here households, so Ethiopian Jews' household expected monthly average income. It was around 9,385 shekels, which isn't a lot. It's more around $3,000 a month. $2,500 a month compared to the 14,501 shekels for all households, which is the average. So that really shows a stark disparity between the national average versus the average for Ethiopians. And what I also found very interesting was that only 10% of Ethiopian Israeli soldiers were able to complete 10 full years of school, which I found very interesting to why and what forced them to not be able to finish school and what made them not want to finish school. And what I found very interesting in talking with people and looking further into my research was many of these students and children needed to leave school in very early ages to be able to help their families and help them work and have enough money to survive in their environment, which I found very saddening. The next group I'm going to talk about is Arab Israelis, the final group that I will be discussing, and I will be comparing them to the rest of Israeli society. Arab Israelis have a complex relation with the state of Israel. While a remainder of Israelis continue to see the celebration of the Jewish state as a positive thing and an empowering movement of history in the nation, 1948, Arab Israelis see the independence of Israel as one of their biggest defeats, and their Independence Day is their day of mourning. While while these Jews see 1948 as the creation of the state, Arab Israelis who live in these areas see that year in our Independence Day as their Nakba, which is one of the most tragic catastrophes ever affected on Palestinian people. The Nakba was the ethnic cleansing and deportation of more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs from land now occupied and seen as Jewish land. While there is proof of Jewish historical connection to the land of Israel, the Palestinian people were pushed out of their homes and communities due to the establishment of the Jewish state, thus making them a stateless people. One of our articles that we read and books that we read was from I'm going to butcher the name, but Nur Masala, who wrote Remembering the Palestinian Nakba. And he discusses the effects of the... She discusses the effects of the Nakba on the Palestinian community today. She writes in this quote, individual accounts of struggle and revolt, displacement and exodus, survival and heroism served as a buffer against national disappearance. Narratives of memory, of oral history became a key genre in Palestinian historiography, a genre guarding against the disappearance from history of the Palestinian people. I found this narrative and this creation of these Palestinian stories very interesting and very saddening, describing the ill treatment and race disparities of Palestinians and Arab Israelis by the Jewish people that is now fueled into their further distaste for Israelis. In Dr. Kedem's lecture on Israeli economy and the integration of Arabs in the Haredim, he included this graph that's in the top right that illustrated the standardized test scores for mathematics, reading, and science sectors of Israeli community. What I found really interesting was the gaps between the Israeli Arab students and other Israeli students, most being more than 100 points lower than the average score. A big reasoning for these grade disparities between Jews and Arab Israelis was the lack of drive and need to achieve a college education within their school systems, and the lack of funding given to these schools, which I found very saddening. So during our study abroad, we focused mostly on the qualitative data that we were finding and researching and interviews. That was a big part of our class on culture diversity in Israel, is actually being in Israel and being able to talk with people who live in Israel every day, everyday lives, how they interact with people, and growing up in this environment. And so I was able to conduct my research with my partner, Ari Chesterman, who I did this presentation with, and we asked questions of a variety of people in Israel, walking in the streets, different people we were able to meet based on our different field trips and such, that helped create our educational experience in Israel. Of the many people we interviewed, I did pick 4 of the interviews that I felt best answered our questions. And for each of these interviews, we asked these questions. Were you taught in a class with majority Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, or Arab students? Did you feel any segregation or racism within the school system? And did you ever have diverse classes? And if so, were they treated as equal? And so the first one I will be talking about is someone who's half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi, and the second one will also be half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi. So there was a lot of similarities between these two individuals. They never really felt segregated or different in any way, shape, or form in Israeli society, and I feel like that also shows the ability for Mizrahis to become more a part of the Ashkenazi culture, but also part of Israeli culture and kind of the meshing of those two cultures. But the only really stark difference between these two people was one was able to have diverse classes, while the other really didn't really have diverse classes, lived in very much in Ashkenazi, Mizrahi areas. And so my first interview actually went to Yad B'Yad, which I later found out was a school with the purpose of pushing social relations between Arabs and Jews in Israel at an early stage of life. And for these reasons, he felt he had a better understanding of Arabs being just like him. Through my qualitative research, I was able to show the disparities of Mizrahis and Ashkenazis kind of equalizing to each other. Though it's still a slow process, it's coming over time, which I think is really beautiful. And then, so talk about those two. And then this person didn't really have a chance to go to school with a diverse range of people, didn't really interact with Arab Israelis, wish that they did have the chance. And then my third interview was an Ethiopian woman who was in her 20s. And she was born in Ethiopia, but she really didn't have any recollection of life in Ethiopia and really sees Israel as her home. In Israel, she grew up in a small town with a pretty small Ethiopian and Russian immigrant population compared to the large Mizrahi population. But there was also a small minority of Ashkenazis who lived in the town. While growing up, she wasn't really aware of the segregation that was really forced on her. She thought it was more to help her over time. And coming from a mixed school, there was a total of maybe 20 or 30 Ethiopian Jews in her grade. But what was really fascinating was 3/4 of her class was Ethiopian. So she never really saw this as a problem growing up. But over time, she came to realize that they were segregating her and other Ethiopians to be with each other. She never really made this correlation. She never really felt segregated, but these barriers were in her life, and she felt that they benefited her education and her way of life. For her, this realization acted as a turning point in understanding the system wanted to separate her from society, not for her benefit, but for her detriment. She talked of how other Ethiopians she met over time felt more segregated living in big cities compared to the area she lived in, which was a smaller city. Those who lived in big cities had classes with almost all Ethiopian students, not only because of the school's systematic segregation, but also the parents of other students did not want to send their kids to schools with Ethiopian Jews. And then my fourth interview was with an Arab Israeli who was actually a researcher at the Triangle Research and Development Center, which was one of our field trips. And the research facility had used science and technology to enact positive learning environment and create social change through inspiring the next generation of Arab Israelis to have an interest in Israel, which I found very fascinating. I know I'm kind of running out of time, so I want to get past this part. But while interviewing the researcher, I asked about his life and how, his program, one of the programs called Science Garden, which integrates, 15 different schools and students varying from ages on becoming interested in science and learning and higher education. He talked about how inclusive the community has become with the research facility being built in. The village surrounding is near all Arab, where many of the children have not been able to have intimate interactions with other ethnic groups in Israel, though he, however, has been able to teach part-time at Hebrew University, and because of that, he's been able to integrate into meeting Jewish students and faculty, but where he lives and has a majority of his friends are still in his village. But growing up, he didn't really interact with Jewish communities at all, mostly just his area, the same area that we were in, which is all Arab Israelis. This trend has continued to an extent with the future generation living in the village. He then moved to talking about the lack of funds given to Arab communities for school and the lack of pushing for higher education in the students. He felt that Science Garden, which is one of his programs, has changed this trend, but he also acknowledges the lack of diversity while still trying to push for higher education, where it will be diverse. Going to different universities in Israel, there is a huge diversity of Jews and Arab Israelis and such. So let's see. So in spite of the issues being discussed above, there has been a push to enact positive change within these different ethnic minorities, which have proven to help equalize these different groups. So for the Mizrahi community, one thing that I found that I feel has helped the integration of Mizrahis into Israeli society has been the Baton Committee, which has enriched Mizrahi culture within the education system in an effort to create a more inclusive and educated system. This is based on Eretz Baton heading the committee. He was the first Mizrahi to win the Israel Prize for Literature, and it's a big part of empowering the Mizrahi identity. Long-term initiatives and other committees such as these will be able to better equalize the education gap in Israel and enrich the education system to be more diverse, not just to the movement of European Jews to Israel, but also all Jews to Israel. the next reform I'm going to talk about is of Arab Israelis. Within the Israeli government, the Knesset passed a 15 billion shekel 5-year plan to better educate and encourage the Arab community's education. The money will be allocated to having more money given per child in school districts and classrooms, and this will further encourage education of women and to pursue increasing overall Arab participation in higher education in the future. Long-run programs and reforms such as this plan, the 5-year plan, will increase the overall Arab community's economy and workforce in the future based on them getting higher education and being able to get higher jobs. And then the last reform I'm going to talk about is the Ethiopian Jews in a nonprofit that I found, which is called the Ethiopian National Project. And I found this really intriguing. The nonprofit aims to empower Ethiopian students through school performance and community empowerment programs. So this is like an after-school program that has allocated their money to tutor students, create safe environments for students with at-risk behaviors, with programs and Ethiopian Israeli role models, which are called youth outreach centers, areas where they can meet these leaders, and develop workshops on crisis and empowerment to instill leadership and skills to create positive change in individuals' lives. The Ethiopian National Project has significantly increased the ability to pass these, to pass their classes, but also to do well on these tests. They've even, in some cases, surpassed the national average of participation of these different certificates. So the students within these programs have actually, in some cases, surpassed the average of Israel's test scores, which I found very fascinating and really telling of how important groups like this are to society. And so through the different programs and initiatives for education reform such as these, minorities have the ability to better integrate into Israeli society and decrease the education gaps of these groups. And so just to kind of wrap up really quick, this study abroad was really beneficial to first my knowledge of Israel and also my knowledge of the world. I was really changed by this trip. Dr. Kevin was very aware of that, and I feel my colleagues are as well. I changed a lot. I learned a lot about myself, but also my passion for Israel and wanting to be able to create change in some way, shape, or form in Israel in the future. So thank you.